Hello everybody, I'm doing my last Viva because we're having construction in our house and it's really loud. Viva part 2 in the car. So this last Viva, oh my gosh. In what ways did the conservative revolution of the 1980s play out? Although we tend to focus on the fundamental changes of the 60s and 70s, the next decade, the 80s, brought America back to normalcy. After the upheaval of the 60s and 70s, the 80s reestablished a broad spectrum that is related to conservative movements. We can see this in the politics, culturally, and relationally. So politically, how do we see this politically? Politically, we see this through, or I guess we can see how in the 60s and 70s there was a lot of fear of nuclear warfare. And so in the 80s, this fear is just lessened because there's less tension between the Soviet Union and America, because the Soviet Union's fighting Afghanistan, they're dealing with Afghanistan, so it's less tension in there, so there's less worry about nuclear warfare. Since there's less worry about nuclear warfare, America is able to focus on inwardly how they can improve and so we get this mid-century centralism, which basically makes Republicans a little more liberal and Democrats a little more conservative. And so it just becomes this kind of chill time where both political parties are more on the same page, more can work together versus always fighting and always having conflict. And so we have less tension with the world, less tension within America. Yes. So, also one part that really impacted American politics and led people kind of more towards conservatism is Jimmy Carter and the Iran hostage crisis. So basically what happened is Iran had a more liberal leader and Carter didn't think that was a good idea, so because conservatism was a little more popular, so he put in a conservative leader, and this just led to radical revolution, and people didn't like it. The Iranian people didn't like it, and so they take over the U.S. embassy and they hold a lot of Americans hostage, and they're held hostage until Reagan is elected. Sorry, there's a construction area. Awkward. So Carter does nothing, and this makes the American people really lose faith in leadership and probably in the government, which is why maybe they were more conservative and why they liked Reagan, because A, he wasn't a politician, B, they didn't want big government because they didn't trust big government right now. So it's just this really interesting time where people lean towards conservatism. A big person who played a big role in this was William F. Buckley, and Buckley was a really big part of the Conservative Party. He says, quote, "A conservative is someone who stands athwart history, yelling stop at a time when no one is inclined to do so, or to have much patience with those who so urge it," end quote. So I think that's an interesting quote about how Buckley viewed conservatism. And I don't know, I think you can see that in how, conservatives would say, like, stop, we don't need help from the government, people do it themselves, and how they just have more patience, it seems, than people who aren't really conservative. They try to find middle ground or try to be patient with people and stuff like that. Obviously not all of them, but I think that's a good conservative value that Buckley points out. He makes this thing called the Buckley correlation, and basically it gives different characteristics to a conservative. So this is just kind of like what conservatives value, I guess, and kind of like what you have to be in order to be conservative. So we have free market, they like traditions, anti-communist, libertarian, pro-life, stuff like that. So just different qualities, and it's called the Buckley Core. So basically this kind of breaks it down into three main factions of conservatism. So we have the conservatism, libertarians, and social conservatism. So we have those three things. And so now moving on to Thatcher, Prime Minister of England, we have Margaret Thatcher, who was a big role in, was it the Cold War, I think? She was a big role in something, I kind of forgot. I think it's Cold War. So this thing is kind of created after her called the Thatcherism. And basically kind of like the Buckley correlation, it's just kind of encouraging and promoting just individuality from state, open economy, decreasing the funds for, social health care and education, and just kind of making everything a little more private, and really fighting for more conservative views. And then we have neoconservatism, which is one of the factions of conservatism, but they are basically a lot of liberals and communists who don't really align with the party anymore, and so they create this new group called neoconservatism, and they basically believe in a more organic nature of society and community above individual, and stuff that's a little more left. So moving on to point 2, culturally, how did we see conservatism kind of creep into culture? So first we see it through minimalism, which is kind of, we can still see today. I think a lot of people promote it, but basically, you're living with, you don't need all the necessities and craziness of life, you just need a simple house, food, that's it. You don't need all the glitz and glamour. So we can see this in architect. Obviously, buildings become more simple, exterior and interior, everything just kind of becomes a little more simple and clean, and just simple. But we can see this in music, and how music, like, we don't get all these complicated tone changes and chord changes and complicated music, but it just becomes more simple and straightforward, and we can hear it in music. So also culturally, there was a book that came out, one of the bestsellers, by Alan Bloom, and he was a philosopher, and his book was called The Closing of the American Mind. And it basically promotes this idea or has this theory of that when you have openness and there's moral relativism, it's really dangerous because it undermines critical thinking, and sorry, my mom texted me. It undermines critical thinking, and it eliminates the point of views from culture that defines culture. So he just believes in absolute truths, and when people, get more open and stuff, it causes for problems because not everybody is held up to a certain standard. He says this in a quote by Alan, or it is more explained in a quote by Alan Bloom, saying, quote, "Openness used to be the virtue that permitted us to seek the good by using reason. It now means accepting everything and denying reason's power," unquote. So again, people were able to kind of be open to having like an absolute good and absolute evil, and like it was, you could reason with it, you know, you could maybe have different perspectives on what was good and evil, but you can argue and talk about it versus just being like, yeah, we're both right, or I'm tolerant, you know. So that was Alan Bloom's kind of theory, and it's obviously more conservative to have absolute truths than maybe where the liberal agenda is more everybody is right, and it's very more open versus closed-minded. Also, I think the terms kind of got changed, because if you define openness as Alan Bloom does, that is different than what openness means today. Same thing with closeness. You hear closed mind and people are like, that's not good, that's bad. But, you know, closed mind just means that you have absolute truth and you have absolute good and evil, and you can reason from that and have different perspectives on that, but that shouldn't change. I think we can see this a lot in our culture today with, or I guess politics today, that there is no more like middle ground, and it's hard to find something where you agree on, because if you agree on a certain point, it's easier to either try to convince the other person or understand the other person. You know, there's just more middle ground. But with the openness of the mind, you can get really far away from each other, creating a lot of division. Hopefully we're not going to go back into the 60s, but who knows. Anyways, got on a little tangent, but I just think it's interesting. The third way we can see conservatism kind of come into play is relationally. So we have this thing that kind of comes up called the yuppie culture, and it basically stands for young urban professionals. And so they are this new generation, this young, 20-year-olds, and there's handbooks that were written for, becoming a good yuppie or whatever, but they were just these hard workers, and they just wanted to, be profitable, and they wanted this like rich party lifestyle, which is interesting, very different from a minimalist. So they just worked in, high companies, and they were just really hard workers, and it was more promotion of like an individual versus in the 60s and 70s where you have this like push for community, and like it was a very, like hippies were very like community based, and there was a lot of like groups and communities, but they are kind of just these individuals, hardworking, kind of, I feel like kind of the thing we look at as like the classic American. So yeah. Oh, and also the 60s and 70s, they obviously kind of rejected society and rejected authority, but the yuppie movement really really think that they should play into society and see, how much we can get out of society and work to make society better. So there's a lot of conflict that comes up between kind of the older generations and younger generations about this. Great example of a yuppie is Trump. Trump is a great example of kind of what a young urban professional looked like. I thought it was a really great quote by NBC in the video that said, quote, "When people attack Trump, they reinforce the version of Trump that Trump wants people to see," end quote. So I thought this was just a really good quote. I know it kind of applies to Trump only, but just how people, they were really confident as a yuppie, and they were really, like they didn't really care. Like when people disagreed with them, they like pushed above it. So anyways, moving on to communication. We have fax machines, cell phones, and pagers kind of come into play, which promoted more privateness and kind of more, I don't know, yeah, more communication. And then we have the AIDS crisis, which is basically, we have the SWA, students with AIDS, and the legalization of gay marriage, which is just all about, this kind of sounds more liberal, but they took the conservative view of, we should have like the right to do this, and yeah, so that just kind of came up. relationally, we have more same-sex marriages and stuff like that. So that was my last Viva. Thank you guys. Although, you know, we focus on the fundamental changes of the 60s and 70s, the next decade really brought about America back to normalcy, and after the upheaval of the 60s and 70s, the 80s reestablish a broad spectrum of related conservative movements through, we can see this through politically, culturally, and relationally. Alright, thank you. Bye, everybody.